Apple powdery mildew. And as with all the other videos, it's always best to start out with the right foot. And the best way to do that is to use the best horticultural practices. And for the most part, this would include things such as high density apple plantings. They're better for color, better yield per acre. You're going to get better coverage with your fungicides, your bactericides, your everything. And particularly with powdery mildew, you want good coverage. Also, one of the other things you're going to get from these is better drying time, better air circulation, and one of the best fungicides in all cases is air. And you can kind of see here, you can just imagine how much better the air circulation, how much better coverage you're going to get with your agrochemicals in this tall spindle versus something like a tall spindle semi-dwarf planting at a much more less dense planting per acre. This is just going to be better in all possible ways. Now, along those lines, it's also going to be really important, particularly with powdery mildew, to really watch your water management. This thing likes a lot of high relative humidity. And in this instance, selecting the best sites. If there's a low-lying area that's going to flood often, it's probably best not to even plant it there. It's going to lead to problem with weeds, insects, other stuff, stress, and may end up bringing in more inoculum and causing more trouble then it's actually worth to have those couple of extra rows. Always make sure to tile your orchards and manage your drip irrigation. Anything that increases your relative humidity for powdery mildew is going to make things a lot worse for this particular disease. And do anything you can to get rid of old dead plant material and just get it out of there. Get rid of weeds. Air circulation is good. And while powdery mildew likes dry weather, still having good air circulation but low relative humidity is going to be key. What else can you do to get started off on the right foot? Well, one of the best things to do is use the less sensitive cultivars. Sometimes apple cultivars can be so sensitive that powdery mildew will even go after the flowers and blight them entirely. Or they may be really sensitive in terms of their fruit finish, and you can get some powdery mildew russeting, which kind of looks like a spider web netting. And in this case, if the inoculum is too heavy and too high, it can end up interfering with the development of the fruit surface. You can use the nice disease susceptibility table of common apples. You can see it has powdery mildew on there. It doesn't know for all of them, but some of the main ones, it will actually give a good rating for how sensitive they are to powdery mildew or susceptible, if you will. Oh, there's some. You can see there's a lot of different ones, and it sort of tells you some of the main ones. And stuff like Cortland is very highly susceptible. Others, we really don't know. But this is constantly getting updated on a yearly basis. So keep an eye on it as new varieties will show up and filter in there. And you can tell how much trouble something like powdery mildew will be. What else do we know? Sanitation. This is good. We talk about it for apple scab, but it's important for all the diseases. In many instances, powdery mildew will survive on prunings and inside buds. The buds that you wanted to save for next year's fruit may be filled with a powdery mildew spores. So it's really important. Anything you can do to remove leaf litter, any pruning, any dead material, even fruit. Fruit's not going to be important for powdery mildew, but just get it out of there. All of this will just give you a better chance of having inoculum build up in years in the future. And in this case, this shows an orchard here from Brazil where they have a machine that will just rake all the leaves, all the prunings, all the fruit drops into the middle, and then another one to sort of chop it all up. And all of that helps the degradation and really reduces the survival of any of the inoculum. And, this can be accomplished with things like fall and spring leaf shredding, raking everything into the middles. The urea, it will degrade anything. So if there's any powdery mildew surviving here, trim it out, trim out dead and dying shoots, put them in there and get rid of them. And that's also where the delayed dormant copper. We often say put that copper on its silver tip. It's going to get in there. It might reduce powdery mildew inside buds. It will definitely reduce apple scab and fire blight, as we talked about in the previous section. So what does powdery mildew really like? It really likes warm, dry weather in the spring and summers. And it's really going to go after the apples when their shoots are growing. And this is the instance where if we end up having periods of drought followed by wet weather, you might get really high humidity, and it may not be great for apple scab, but this is where powdery mildew will become a problem. And it could become a bigger problem as we get more and more erratic weather in periods of drought. And in periods of drought, you might have to turn on the drip, and that might actually increase the humidity inside the canopy, and you might end up having trouble with powdery mildew. And unfortunately, a lot of the cultivars that we like to plant, we either don't know how susceptible they are, or they're fairly susceptible to powdery mildew. It's not something that we typically bleed for resistance or look for resistance. But as the climate changes, it could become a bigger problem. And one of the things that can happen is it usually starts at this stage when your new shoot growth is really small. This is a shoot that is sort of malformed, and it's an overwintering shoot. This was infected as a bud, and now it has burst forth in this malformed thing and spreading spores everywhere. And as the shoots grow, the powdery mildew will have a better chance of infection. It can't infect these leaves. They're too hard for it. It's going to go for the younger new leaves. So the spores off here will go flying through the air and infect those new shoots. And if it left unchecked to harvest, it can be quite a problem, and may even really impact overwintering or the health of the plant as it goes into dormancy, and can really harm your return bud sets as well. And it's also been a situation where we wondered, do we have fungicide resistance? It's hard to tell. You can't test this in the lab because you can't grow it on media. It only likes to grow on the host, which is an unfortunate thing. And so we see things like this, and we see trees that are heavily compromised. How much is this affecting? Do we have fungicide resistance now? This is a plot from a tree from one of my plots from a DMI plot, and the tree looks defoliated. It looks white. It looks covered. It looks really ratty. And we've been in a situation where we used to use the DMI fungicides. We sort of stepped away from them when the apple scab populations became resistant for the most part. And we've often, is the mildew population also resistant? It gets the same number of applications. In the old days, you could put a DMI fungicide on and you would never see mildew whatsoever. But now they're less effective, it seems. And the QOI fungicides were very effective in the 1990s. And they're still really great now, but they just seem slightly less effective. And unfortunately, the new single-site chemistries that we have coming to market, such as the SDHIs, are just not as strong as the other two when they were first introduced. And then oftentimes growers have to rely on frequent applications of sulfur, which may end up having their own troubles with potential injury if it gets too hot, or it just may make the orchard unpleasant, as sulfur is often unpleasant to spray and unpleasant to walk around in after it's been sprayed. So with any of the others, we've often shown the disease cycle and talked about how the different sanitation practices could come in and impact mildew. Now, it's not often known. Mildew oftentimes will begin as a primary infection where it was infected the previous summer. We'll talk a little bit about this briefly. And as this infected bud breaks, or infected fruit bud breaks, it may end up making a malformed shoot or malformed fruit cluster. And on this are these mats of spores of Conidia. And these will fly around, and they will begin to reinfect new developing leaf tissue and make new infections, and they make new spores, and then they might end up impacting the development of the fruit peel and end up leading to damage to the epidermis of the fruit, and then rejections at that point when they are interfering with the cells as they are developing and expanding. And at that particular point, as the tree begins to go dormant, all of these spores can reinfect developing buds. And as they go into overwinter, they may, instead of being a nice clean bud, but they may be the next one of these heavily infected buds in the next spring that ends up bursting forth with powdery mildew infected shoots. So what can you do early on? We don't know if this is actually very economically valuable, but in theory, if you're pruning out shoots or pruning out these primary shoots, that will reduce a lot of the inoculum. And as we've talked about with the others, here's your example disease progress curve of powdery mildew incidence, some time, and then harvest. Or you can think of this as hitting terminal bud set. When the tree isn't growing and putting out new leaves, powdery mildew has limited options of causing damage. And so one can begin to think well, wait a minute, does this do anything here? If I prune this out, am I actually pushing the curve? I might be, but it may not be enough to warrant that as a practice. What about other silvertip fungicides? Does the copper get into the buds when they're breaking and they have powdery mildew spores in them and reduce them? In theory, it could even delay the start of your epidemic so that by the time you got the terminal bud set, you'd have less. What about a good green tip fungicide? We usually apply fungicides that are effective for apple scab. What if we did one for powdery mildew? Would it have a chance to get into these overwintering structures and stop it? Where we usually focus a lot of our efforts on is later in the season. Once we start hitting, we really don't work on a lot of pink to green tip protection fungicides. We really focus our efforts on here. And this is the secondary phase. And once it starts cycling, infecting, and more infecting, sporulating, infecting, that's where things get really crazy and the disease goes from the slow build up to a quick exponential curve. And so what we typically do to manage the disease is take fungicides on, and when we put this on, they reduce this, and that reduces the next round of infection. We flatten this part. We make that exponential part bend down so that over time, by the time you get to terminal bud set and the tree stops growing, there's no new leaves for it to be to be infected, and this is what we're usually going for. And the materials that work really well are the single-site fungicides. The mancozebs, the captans don't work well, but you can do well with sulfur. And so for that part, chemical management typically now, as we know it, usually involves secondary powdery mildew. The primary infection happened last summer. It burst forth and then made all these other infections that constantly reinfect your plant. But what we know now is what's not as effective is the captan and mancozeb that we use for apple scab. Sulfur is about your only option with these. However, if you want to go with the single-site fungicides, there's a lot, and they are generally as effective in this order. The DMIs, if there's not a lot of resistance, then the QI fungicides, and then finally the SDHI fungicides. And the key period being right around this time. Once these things are popped out, that's when you're going to start wanting to protect against this nonsense and that nonsense from happening, having your fruit finish get damaged by powdery mildew spores. We don't want that. For the most part, there aren't a lot of models, and they might help, and they might be good, particularly if our climate changes and powdery mildew becomes a bigger problem. But for the most part, the models are time for apple scab.